benefits, those virtues of the history, the accumulated wisdom, the experience that Western governments and firms have, one has to be inside the tent. And I think Mike began to articulate what I think is sort of a three-part strategy towards whatever our resource deficits may be diplomatically and handicaps may be, at least in principle, three things we should be doing. The first is the obvious one, like you said, restore and strengthen the relationships with the existing allies. The second, by the way, is very controversial, but Graham Allison did a piece this weekend also mentioning, which was that Russia is actually a country that we're going to have to inevitably re-engage with. It's very concerned about its power asymmetry vis-a-vis China. The same applies to other countries that we've generally isolated, like Iran, right? Whenever Iran has an opportunity to take commercial tender or acquisition from a European partner versus a Chinese one, it's going to go with the European one, right? And we have evidence of that over the last few years in terms of gas field development and so forth. So if you think about, again, what are the natural hedges to China not being able to have its way with countries that have no choice in the marketplace because we've frozen them out? Well, if we engage with them, actually, that gives them that choice. And guess what? They're going to be just as cautious about China as everyone who's actually China's neighbor. The third point is the one about the institutions that Mike said. And one of the arguments I make that's at this point literally too controversial for print, but eventually it will get out there, is that we should actually join the Belt and Road. And you heard it here first, but let me explain what I mean, which is that the Belt and Road, again, is China, and then 30, 40, 50, whatever growing number of far weaker countries. But in the Belt and Road Charter, it actually says we respect the principles of free enterprise, the private sector must lead, and so forth. But is that actually going to happen when China and a whole bunch of, I don't want to be crude, but sort of less than well-governed states gather together in Beijing for a big kumbaya? Not really going to happen. The only way you're actually going to make sure that the standards are high and so forth, and that the loans are not at non-concessional rates, is if America is there, Canada is there, Germany is there, Britain is there, and then we say, hey, wait a minute, why did, whether fill in the blank, Angola or Mozambique or Oman or whomever, just forced into these terms that don't make sense for them. But instead, if you're there, if you're a signatory to this, you could say, hey, wait a minute. No, I mean, one thing's for sure. If you know anything about Germany and German businesses and a company like Siemens, they're not going to allow a Chinese contractor to get the sort of inside track on something when they can compete and they're better, right? So we need to be inside the tent. And this is not a radical theory. It's not a hypothetical. This is exactly how diplomacy operates. We created Bretton Woods institutions, and now as rising powers have come in, they challenge our views, right? They dilute us from within, right? They speak against us. China has experienced this itself already with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, which was sometimes described as the NATO of the East. But India has been lobbying to join the group. And now that Russia acquiesced and supported India joining the group, now it's a group that China founded, and China can't always get what it wants. So how do you make sure that in a club like the Belt and Road is, very loosely defined with no real normative, sort of superstructure, how do you make sure that it doesn't just get what it wants? You actually join it.
So let me be the sort of, I'll admit, sort of unreconstructed American here, okay, reacting to that. The way you describe One Belt, One Road, it sort of sounds like the Marshall Plan. And I never in the past confused One Belt, One Road with the Marshall Plan.
No.
The Marshall Plan seemed to be very different, very differently motivated than that. My impression was, it's the rule I learned back in college was Tonstaffel. There's ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Mm-hmm. That basically China is doing this for good and sufficient reason for their own best interest. Yeah. But for us to go in and play into that, don't we play into that quite directly?
No, we're actually doing, this is what I described as the roadmap, the tactical roadmap to getting to exactly what Mike said, which is how do we help these countries actually pick the best projects that are going to actually help them grow so that they become, because we're not going to compete with China on building bridges and roads and deploying even the volume of loans that they are. But we want these economies to grow because they're going to be our next set of export markets, right, in Asia. And the richer they get, the more they're going to want to, I hate to use the phrase buy American, but you know what I mean. And otherwise, it's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because this is what we fear. Why else would we be so, cynical about China if we didn't fear their intentions, which is exactly the nature of your question. If you're actually asking what are you going to do about it, you cannot but come to the conclusion that I've come to, which is that you have to get inside the tent and compete.
So, Mike, let's put you on the spot. Might be a slightly different answer. Well, I was going to say, so let's put you back on the National Security Council, National Economic Council. The memo crosses your desk. Let's join One Belt, One Road. Yeah. What do you do?
I think the concern is real, but I think I don't have great faith that from inside we're going to be able to have the kind of influence given where it is. And I would instead be working with the countries in Central Asia, in the other parts of Asia, to make sure that they've got the tools available to negotiate the very best deals, that they're getting good advice. You're hopefully strengthening governance and making sure that there's not corruption, so that you're limiting whatever the negative consequences of it might be. But I think at this point, I don't think it's really realistic to think that we can join and have any significant amount of influence over it. And by the way, separate from Belt and Road, looking at Africa, I think we need to do the same thing. I think there, where China's been active for a number of years, as you said, including building infrastructure, I think a number of African countries have stood up and said, well, we don't like the quality of the work, we don't like the impact on governance, we don't like the political strings that come attached, and are beginning to stand up, and we ought to, again, it's in their interest to get investment in infrastructure. We can't argue with that. And we're not likely to build a lot of roads across Africa. One reason we launched Power Africa is because, to your point, there was private sector interest and capacity in the United States to invest in electricity generation and transmission in Africa. That's an area where we could help contribute, and in a way that was above board with high standards, subject to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the like. And that's the kind of role that I think we can play.
I just want to build on that because, again, one of the things we underestimate is the extent to which other Asians are also riding coattails on China for their own benefit. And what I try to do in the case of Africa in the book is to kind of document how China has had this first mover advantage in many countries. It's gone in, built the relationships, built some of the infrastructure, started to transform commercial relationships and the landscape to its own benefit. But given the dissatisfaction that sometimes exists with China, the door is then open to other Asian countries. So what I've shown in the case of Ethiopia and other countries is that what has happened is that in the cases where there's, again, dissatisfaction, disappointment, termination of relationships with Chinese companies, Indians move right in. Right. You can see it in textiles, for example, in Ethiopia. You can see it in Nigeria as well with some of the activity. India as a whole, India's really prioritized Nigeria, for example, and you can see it in other countries too. We often forget that because of the legacy of the British Empire, there are millions of, but if you look at the cover of The Economist magazine, that's not what you're going to see. You're going to see a Chinese sentry riding on a horse marching across Africa, forgetting that you have 3 million Indians living just mostly in East Africa alone. Right. So again, we need a much more nuanced picture of Asia's collective impact, and it isn't just China's impact. Sometimes China is just opening the door, then it kind of turns around and walks away or gets kicked out, and then other Asians move in.